He made you in his image. You're a product of Bith science. The Bith laughed harshly.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will cover everything from legends and canon on the Bith species, their homeworld, biology, and subspecies, a culture that led them to the eugenic supercomputer that organized their entire society, nuclear war that would forever change them, and their impact on the galaxy at large, ranging from musicians to the master of Darth Plagueis, and how a Bith Sith's attempt to create the ultimate Sith through science triggered the Force to produce the Chosen One through miracle, to finally end the Sith once and for all. But first I want to thank this video's sponsor, Geology. They are a 9-time award-winning men's skincare company with 5,000 plus 5-star reviews, and I can see why. I took a 30-second quiz and my products were sent out right away. Geology skincare is built on actual proven ingredients, no fluff, and these little cards teach you everything, explaining your 2 steps in the morning and 3 at night. Start the day with the face wash and then moisturizing cream, then end the night with another face wash. They had the simple but genius move to give you 2 bottles so that you can leave one in the shower and one at the sink. And so when you're getting ready for bed, you wash and then apply the eye cream followed by the night cream. As simple as it can be, and helps with everything from reducing oiliness, fighting acne, preventing wrinkles, and what I need most, combating those dark puffy eyes that you get from staying up all night reading ancient Sith tomes. So if you're like me and don't want to end up looking like Big Palpy, head to geology.com and take their free skincare quiz, and save up to 70% off your 30-day trial. Even better, join their new Geology Galaxy community for daily tips, giveaways, and more at discord.gg/geology. Thanks again to Geology for sponsoring this video. Their story begins at grid coordinates M18 in the Outer Rim, within the Maya Gil sector, neighboring Tarkin's homeworld of Eriadu and Yoda's resting place of Dagobah. Their system had 1 sun and 6 planets with an asteroid belt, all of which were named CLAK'DOR, so the very last position was CLAK'DOR 7, which had a 26-hour day, 647 days in a year, 9,881 kilometer diameter, and a Type 3 atmosphere. But its atmosphere wasn't always like this. It likely was Type 1, as Bith can breathe in normal atmospheres, and do not require a mask like the Doran. Why it changed from Type 1 to Type 3 is the result of a war we'll cover in a bit. Evolving in the jungle among countless predators, like most humanoids, they had to rely on social bonds and superior intellect to survive. With the seas full of stinger eels, and the jungles dominated by rancor-like Organoks and the freaky Gik. As society advanced, they domesticated some animals, like the Gik, milking these gross sacks for their oil, which was found to have great healing properties. This creature was so odd and powerful, it would become famous across the galaxy as a hollow monster in the game Dejarik. And from their earliest memories, these people loved music, as the jungle sounds were filled with singing birds, the unique hoot bat, and puffer turtle, which would scare off predators by filling up its large bladders, and shouting out a sound that was like a low note on a bassoon. Something Figrin D'an worked into some of his songs, along with other animal sounds calling back to home, something that all species liked, but was especially meaningful for homesick Bith. The modern Bith would stand 1.5 to 1.75 meters, or 5 foot 4 inches on average, with smooth skin that could range from green, pink, red, or yellow, and an average lifespan of 85 years, maturing at the same rate as humans. Their long, 5-fingered hands with opposable thumbs allowed them to produce complex machines, and these people were one of the earliest to reach a technologically advanced society. Having large eyes, they were able to work at minuscule detail, seeing things that humans would require a microscope for, and this allowed them to have some of the most complex microcircuitry. Eventually, they evolved past the need for sleep. Instead, they would meditate for short periods in a trance-like state, and eventually their eyelids completely receded until there was effectively nothing left, though they were still protected from light injuries and dust with the translucent shell that covered their eyes. Their respiratory system is incredibly effective, and one of the most curious of all species out there. Their nose only takes breath in, can't blow it out, and that air went into a single lung and then into the bloodstream, where waste gases are exhaled through the skin and not through breath. Bith olfactory senses are within the skin folds on their cheeks, and provide exceptional sensitivity, originally to pick up on the thousands of distinct smells they might experience at any moment in the lush jungle, and later used to detect the slightest chemical presence in more industrial settings. Like humans, this olfactory sense was one of the most directly connected in their nervous system, a quick line to the brain meaning their smell was one of their most trusted senses, and allowed them to avoid ambushes or chemical explosions. While their most striking feature, this enormous cranium, was something they created through high-tech eugenics. A relatively recent creation, though still well established by the first contact with alien species, their entire society was managed by complex artificial intelligence programs. especially for procreation. If you wanted to be a parent, you would enter your DNA sample into the CMS, or Computer Mating Service, which matches it up with the opposite sex. The CPs, or child pairings, are presented, showing a list of your optimal pairings. It allowed for the flexibility of choosing from a list of candidates, as this became so refined that the outcomes were considered equally likely of positive outcomes, and everything from birth defects to laziness were made a statistical impossibility. And most important of all, that this offspring would at least have a greater IQ than its parents, with responsible parents shooting for an entire standard deviation greater. Most species would see this as creepy and incredibly dystopian, but its results did work to accelerate their society into one that produced incredible works at all levels, from art, music, and philosophy, to fusion reactors and faster-than-light travel. But while their society seemed enlightened and post-scarcity in all ways, there is an incredibly dark aspect to the CMS, other than the obvious lack of love being a factor, and that they are just obeying a computer program. Besides that horror, what is worse is that the governments at power that implemented this forever denied a return to a more natural means of reproduction. After all these millennia of selecting only for the most socially beneficial biological traits, allowing their equivalent of sperm and eggs to be sent into the CMS incubation stations for optimal breeding environments, while also allowing the Bith to stay an active and productive member of society. Like their eyelids, their sex organs withered over the generations, to the point that the males only have this one big head, nothing visible down under, and the females no longer had a functional womb. Needles would painlessly extract the required matter from both sexes to make their designer babies. The Bith birthing process no longer required that barbaric and bloody process of their ancestors. Their whole society was perfectly pain-free. Over a year, you and your spouse would have moved in together, and since the computer took in all kinds of matchmaking criteria based on your personality and interests, you probably felt like the AI gave you your soulmate. And after this year, a droid unit would deliver the baby right to your door. It is likely some Bith questioned this system, and perhaps a concerted effort to use this same high tech could have found ways to reverse this state to get their reproductive organs back. But as it is, at least publicly, most Bith are proud of the CMS, while many species saw their history as a powerful warning. Recorded history on CLAK'DOR 7 goes back millions of years, and is currently covered in various city-states, which did war with each other in the distant past, but eventually there was a general global peace. War being so ancient and primitive of a concept that it was hard to grasp, like the idea of spirit worship or magic powers. It was hard to see how people back then could think that war actually produced results, as they were now ruled by the government assembly, which was based in the city that came to be recognized as this planet's capital, WEOGAR. This city was likely chosen because it was already the cultural capital of the world, housing the Porgom Musical Performance Hall. And though far off from the core, it was relatively easy to get here with the creation of the Rima trade route circa 5500 BBY. Bith spread through most corporations, universities, and arts, and during the Old Republic era, they were one of the most common species along with humans and Twi'leks. Many of them were detected by the Jedi Order as being Force-sensitive, but there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation to IQ and Force powers. Some highly advanced people have a lower percentage of Force-sensitives. Some simpler species are immune to Force tricks, while others are especially weak, and some have no Force connection at all, while some animals can manipulate the Force just for hunting. It's one of the true mysteries, and keep that in mind when we look at Plagueis and Tenebrous at the end. These people would often be under Sith Imperial rule during the Old Republic, though not always. But no matter who claimed their sector, they always provided so many goods and services that neither force hoped to get them on their bad side. During the Brotherhood of Darkness's reign, their world would again be outside of Republic rule, but they still saw no real violence, though they made sure to play a bigger role after the Sith were believed to be completely eliminated, and hoped for galactic peace with the Ruusan Reformations, where the Republic dissolved their military in 1000 BBY. But 700 years later, CLAK'DOR 7 would be changed forever. Two of their most powerful cities, NOZHO and the capital WEOGAR, were rapidly descending into a bitter rivalry. Inter-city strife was almost non-existent, resolved via negotiations usually outside of court, but there was a channel for the unlikely event that both parties became intractable. Major companies from each city were in competition to secure patent rights on a new star drive. The political leaders of each city were financially involved, and if this Bith-made star drive became the standard drive across the galaxy, the credits that could be earned were unimaginable. They could be a staple like Kuat Drive Yards, Corellian Engineering Corps, or at least replace the fading giant Rendili star drives. They were supposed to appeal to a neutral arbitrator, but the agent from NOZHO decided to try and dig up intel on the arbitrator and blackmail him into choosing their city. This worked, but the mayor of WEOGAR's agents discovered the threat, and thus he ignored the decision. Both would continue production of this star drive, and for the first time in their thousands of years in the modern era, there was actual bloodshed. Small groups attacked the factories of their rival, and eventually some were killed in these exchanges, while the counterattacks kept increasing in violence, fanning the flames to the point that these two cities were at open war with each other. The other cities watched on in confused horror. Their computer simulations provided no solution for this very organic problem, fueled by personal loss of friends and families, sparked by pride, ambition, and honor. NOZHO leadership thought that with the official legal favor, they should just put an end to this, and then worry about patching up their relationship with the other cities. They launched a bioweapon on WEOGAR that killed 90% of their population. As insane as this was, that number was too low. The leadership of WEOGAR felt abandoned by their global government, and they would not make the same mistake as their rivals. In a twisted way, they also hoped to prove that they were the true technological power and truly innovative city-state. They unleashed their remaining arsenal of experimental weapons, and were believed to reach a 100% kill rate. NOZHO was no more. But this weapon had global effects as well. Some warheads contained gene-altering bioweapons, others were ancient forms of nuclear radiation, and all of it was picked up by the powerful winds, and before long, the entire atmosphere was polluted. Within a few generations, their homeworld was unrecognizable. The other cities had to completely shift their entire economy towards constructing protective bubbles. CLAK'DOR was now covered in disparate domed islands, many in isolation from each other, and no one could step outside without hazmat equipment in this Type 3 atmosphere. And the wildlife that survived was rapidly altered by the gene-modifying viruses and radiation, creating a hellscape that cut these cities off from natural resources from food to mines. Almost everything they consumed now would come from off-world trade. The people who hailed tech as their savior and provider for their civilization were nearly made extinct by their high-tech capabilities. And it destroyed the image of a perfectly planned global society of peace and productivity. Once strong and independent, all life at home was dependent on alien imports, and each generation moved out into the galaxy at higher and higher rates. Many cities became ghost towns, and some thought they were literally seeing ghosts in the epicenter of NOZHO. These odd-looking beings were called the Bith, or Ghost Bith, and it was believed that this city must not have been completely killed off. That these mutated Bith were the descendants of those warmongers that fired that first missile. And now living in the fallout, these Bith were the opposite of Bith. They were physically powerful, but had poor eyesight and were prone to violent outbursts. But they were still intelligent enough to try and make good with their Bith brothers, and did take some responsibility. They tried their best to earn their forgiveness, but they would never again see global peace, and the Bith would eventually all but abandon their homeworld to colonize CLAK'DOR 4, naming their capital New NOZHO, and devoting their bioengineers to try and stabilize their genome, feeling the need to turn to tech to fix the problems it caused, and hoping not to repeat their fate. Though this city would become a thriving trade port, even alien outsiders came to look down on the Ghost Bith, likely because of their outbursts, and they never did fit into the galactic community, usually always staying in the fringes of society, from the deep lower levels of Coruscant to Nar Shaddaa and Tatooine. As the years went by, the Bith were horrified to find another mutated branch. The AUDIBLE were so devastated by the fallout that though you could still see that large cranium, they were literally blown back into the Stone Age. They only lived in remote pockets, and were theorized to be the descendants of the smaller mining communities and Bith that were outside of the major cities. Language was rudimentary, they hunted and gathered, and their only notable cultural creations were symbolic representations of myths and tracking of their ancestry in the form of tied knots. Since all this went down around 300 BBY, the following 3 centuries would see vocal Senate members that pushed for peace, hoping to use their sharp minds as negotiators and pointing to their home as a warning. A tour of CLAK'DOR usually helped to scare leaders straight, though they were well aware that the corruption in the Senate helped to fuel so much animosity. And in the final decade of this hallowed institution, Bith senators found themselves being called separatists. They disagreed as they hoped for unity, but they did feel that if systems wanted to withdraw from the government, they should be allowed to do so, and hoped that they would do so peacefully. Without knowing Count Dooku's secret Sith plot, it is very easy to see the events of Geonosis as favorable for the newly formed Confederacy of Independent Systems. The Jedi Order had an ill-defined role in the Republic, and were constantly looking like a military branch. Then out of nowhere they pop up with an entire army, and scramble it all the way out to the Outer Rim, to launch a rescue mission because some Jedi and a senator were caught committing espionage on an independent world. The Bith saw that the Senate was being controlled more by fear and bloodlust than logic and goodwill. The CIS army was just the local defense forces that only existed in the first place because of the Republic's inability to police its territories. So most Bith saw siding with the CIS as the obvious choice. But even if they didn't, the choice would have been made for them, as their location in the Outer Rim had them surrounded by separatists. As Thal Kassar would tell Anakin after the human said that his species was on the wrong side, he said, quote, "CLAK'DOR 7 had little choice. The Separatists were offering unrestricted access to hyperspace routes, better deals on trade goods, no interference." Most saw the CIS as equally flawed at worst, but they quickly came to hate the new empire. If you asked an Imperial officer, these Bith were just barely humanoid, and though some humanoids like Thrawn could advance, the Bith love of pacifism was itself a form of treason against Imperial ethos, so Imperial overlords would be put over them to keep the tech pumping, and make sure it stayed out of rebel hands. Many Bith would revitalize an older form of Bith language that focused on using numerical and symbolic meanings to create a code talk that was easy for them to speak in, but utterly confusing if you didn't understand their culture and idioms, and if you didn't have the raw brain power to crunch numbers on the fly. It works something like this. If it happened on Earth, you could work in an idiom, a rebel asks you where to find his contact, and you say, "Oh, he's under the weather." Imagine there was a statue of Zeus in the city, a weather god, and in their mythos you know that the day is masculine and the night is feminine, but also the numbers of the words in the idiom let you know the time. So you will meet your rebel spy during the day, he'll be standing under the Zeus statue at 5:37 p.m. The big brain Bith were able to process conversations like that so smoothly that the Imperials never cracked this or even suspected it. A defected TIE bomber pilot turned X-Wing pilot Red 9, NOZHO-WEOGAR, would lead the liberation effort on CLAK'DOR. A humanitarian effort, but surely a very practical choice as well. This did prove successful, and was just months before the Battle of Yavin. They would prove powerful allies during the next 4 years, but after Endor they wanted to stay independent for some time, but finally became convinced by the Happin's enthusiastic support for the New Republic. The city-states agreed to again form a global unified government and send off their new senators. Their world would prove valuable during the Thrawn campaign, though they would not be affected by the Yuuzhan Vong War. Its attempt at revival also saw them reclaim some cultural recognition as well. The Pergam Musical Performance Hall, despite being in the Outer Rim, was a rival to the galaxy's opera house in the upper levels of Coruscant, and prized itself on selling out 2-week shows of all sorts of instruments, from cultures all across the stars, having no snobbery, you just had to be the greatest at your craft. Surprising famous acts included a Gamorrean singer, and a percussion group that evoked sounds from hundreds of species and instruments, but also the infamous riot caused by the Wookiee artist Warrock. All music is a form of emotional manipulation, so he figured he could make a piece of music so dialed into the audience's brainwave patterns that your piece could act like a sort of mind control. He decided to test this on the Bith live on the Pergam stage. And it worked better than anyone could imagine, maniacally laughing as he watched the Bith audience get whipped up into a frenzy. The Pergam riot spilled into the streets, and reports struck everyone with fear of another unstoppable escalation that would end in global war. But it quickly fizzled out. Warrock was arrested, and unsure of what laws to keep him on, they decided on just escorting him off-world and banning him forever. And the last thing I wanted to touch on are the often overlooked origins of Darth Plagueis. The Mun, born Higo Damask, was a product of Bith eugenic science. See, Darth Plagueis' master was Darth Tenebrous, a Bith trained in the Bane line of Sith, who had a CMS program that he could use to study the potential pairings of not just Bith, but other species too. On his travels throughout the galaxy, he was always keeping a record of Force sensitives that he met, and finding secret ways to collect DNA samples. Tenebrous was born Rugus Nome, and his master was a Twi'lek Sith Lord that worked with him to create a virus that could cut one off from the Force, hoping to release it near the Jedi Temple and let it spread throughout their precious stronghold. Though this project never planned out, it was based on the discovery of MetaGonks, the tiny organisms that acted as conduits of Force expression. Just like how the Jedi scanned blood for MetaGonks, he would scan those he met outside of Republic space, those not subjected to these tests at birth. That's why Anakin was not picked up by the Jedi, and there were countless beings of varying ability all throughout the stars. Tenebrous knew that you didn't have to fully understand the Force to manipulate it, and at the end of the day, basic biology could be used to create those powerful in the Force. One day he found a Mun female that exhibited a heightened midichlorian level, and through his manipulations, he turned her into a dark acolyte, training her to be sensitive to others with a heightened presence in the Force. As more and more candidates' DNA were entered into the CMS, they hoped to find a perfect pairing for this Mun female. Tenebrous finally found his target, a mid-level administrator on Megiddo named Car Damask. This man was courted by the female Mune acolyte, and Tenebrous would develop a friendship with him in the Bith's public persona as Rugus Gnome, a renowned wealthy ship designer. Eventually, after they felt they could trust the man, they explained their plan, and Car Damask made a deal with the Sith Devil. If he were to sire a child with the Acolyte, Tenebrous would manipulate the leadership in the intergalactic banking clan, and if Car gave over his child to the Dark Lord, he would be rewarded with unprecedented advancement within the most powerful financial empire in the galaxy.
Whose task it had been to romance Car and bear the fruit of that seduction. A child whom Gnome and Bith science predicted would be born strong in the Force.
Car agreed, and the woman would live with them as a codicil, or side wife. They would give birth to a son, naming him after his grandfather, Higo. The child would be raised like a lab rat. The mother became experimental psychologist, tracking all of the boy's daily behavior, having daily therapy/confessionals, where the mom would push him to lean into his darker emotions. She is one of the most diabolical Darksiders in history, and she also has to appear as a nice housewife all this time as well, secretly reviewing data with Tenebrous, constantly tweaking and developing new ways to grow this boy in the dark side, corrupting him slowly, day in and day out for years. By 5 years old, the housewife had gathered a group of neighborhood kids that she would let play with her son, all while monitoring him, getting him to do entire debriefs on the other kids and what he thought of each one, as well as guiding him to manipulate these kids as well. Higo was realizing that he could use his mind to affect things around him, both by moving things physically, but most curiously, he could change the mental state of his friends. His mom noticed one boy that Higo could not get along with, and slowly pushed him to visualize bad things happening to this boy. Eventually the day came where Higo was so angry with him that he focused on trying to make the boy walk to the window, and calling on his hatred, he used the Force to make the boy jump, falling several stories to his horrific death in the courtyard down below. The community was rocked, and the mom made it seem like it was just an accident, that in the split second she wasn't watching him, the rambunctious boy got out of sight and must have been trying to imitate some holovid heroes. Higo was a bit shaken by this as well, but his mom said that she knew he used his powers, and revealed that she had these powers as well, that they were special and above these simple people, but he must learn to keep these powers a secret. Shortly after this, Rugus Gnome arrived at the Damask home, and Car agreed to honor his deal, letting his son walk away with the Sith Lord.
With a nod toward Gnome, he said, "In truth, and in ways that you will eventually come to understand, you belong to him."
While over the next 5 years, doors kept opening for Car, and eventually he rose to the top, sitting as the chairman of the IBC. The Bith Dark Lord prized his unholy creation, would name him Darth Plagueis, and teach him in the Sith science. Some of it was surprisingly mundane and practical, tied to Tenebrous's unique plan to destroy the Jedi, hoping to use computers and social planning to provide for everyone's needs across the entire galaxy. He hoped that once all these practical needs were met, appealing to the Jedi Order would be obsolete.
With the aid of sophisticated computers and future-casting formulas, the varied beings of the galaxy could be provided for, and the Jedi Order would gradually dwindle and disappear.
Later in life, Plagueis would point out the folly in this.
Convinced that Tenebrous's brilliant equations were missing an important factor, he had argued that future events, whether predicted by machines or glimpsed in visions, were often clouded and unreliable.
Peace and plenty seemed like a good thing, but Plagueis understood his master's darker purpose, to cut the Force out of people's lives, something he knew the Force would not idly stand by and allow. So if the Force intended creation to have chaos and evil, Plagueis would be the lord of it all. After Plagueis killed his master in typical Bainite Sith fashion, he was not aware that Tenebrous had already mastered the creation of MAXI-CHLORIANS. The Bith believed the key to immortality was through altering MIDI-chlorians, and while the MIDI-chlorians would obey the will of the Force and abandon their hosts to return to the living Force and find new hosts, Tenebrous created a retrovirus, likely inspired by the work of his own late master, which, though it did cut off the ability of precognition in the Force, the converted organisms, which he dubbed MAXI-CHLORIANS, were now stuck in the host. Though immune to dying from old age, he was killed by his apprentice, though his consciousness was retained, and like how a living Sith could pop in people's minds, he would monitor Darth Plagueis, only to be disgusted by the Dark Lord's plan for the galaxy, seeing that it would result in a backlash by the Force that would destroy the Sith. He would use his will to leave Plagueis and try and animate in his own body, but found that while the MAXI-CHLORIANS were stuck, so too was his consciousness. His mind was stuck in a hellish prison. As the body dissolved by the elements, his mind was stuck in a loop, replaying the moment of his death over and over. While the Bith Master was stuck in a hell of his own creation, Plagueis took his master's research further than he ever dreamed, hoping to completely understand and control the midichlorians and the Force itself. Expanding on the Bith's labs, he would eventually come across a secret apprentice of Tenebrous, another Bith called Darth Venemus.
But who then? Tenebrous's offspring, perhaps? Some spawn grown from his genetic material in a laboratory?
When Venemus became the second Bith Sith the Mune had bested, he was captured alive and brought into Plagueis' lab, floating unconscious in a Bacta tank next to another tank that contained a Yinkori. This species was Force resistant, and so along with his highly Force-powered Sith, his experiments in the Force threatened the fabric of reality itself. In response, the Force struck back in the form of Anakin's birth. The Sith were to be finally destroyed. Where they hoped to dominate through scientific power, the Force would vanquish them through the power of miracle. So that's it for the Bith breakdown. As for cool facts and behind the scenes stuff, the original name was to be Sikmu, a phonetic anagram for music. Their costume was created by Doug Beswick, who also played the role of Valyrian Karn. Most of this info comes from role-playing guides, the Atlas and Guide to Species, and the Darth Plagueis and Labyrinth of Evil novels. If you made it this far, please hit that like button, leave a comment, or share the video. These are the best ways to help me out, and subscribe if you want to see more. There's links down below for all kinds of free stuff and discounts, and special shout out to our supporters over on Patreon. But most important of all, remember, unpredictability is a force of nature, and the Force will be with you, always.